Okay, well, welcome everyone to what is the last in the seminar series, because we're now obviously in summer, as you can feel. It's not often it's too hot in this room. I want you all to pretend that it's always like this in Scotland, so that Tereza comes originally from Greece and now from London, that Scotland is a blessed land which is not only beautiful but always sunny and warm, isn't it? I'm really pleased that Tereza has managed to make it up. I've met her over the years many times through the International Society of Political Psychologists, and I think Tereza really does qualify for that label. Lots of us sort of flirt with it, but she really is at the core, being a psychologist who's in a politics department and who teaches psychological models and theories within politics, and has been very important, I think, in bringing together those different disciplines. Interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary work is never easy. Currently, Tereza is at the University of Surrey. She's come there by a truly multinational route, through Leiden University in the Netherlands, through Stony Brook in upstate New York. She's worked on a wide variety of topics within political psychology, so issues of tolerance, of candidate selection, gender and candidate selection. As I say, I think a fascinating and broad variety of topics, but always coming together in looking at the interface between the political and the psychological. And I could read out the title for you, just to tell you what she's talking about today, but I suspect that most of you can read, so I won't. I just want to say a very warm welcome to Tereza. Delighted that you could make it up.
Well, before I start, I need to extend the thanks back, because Steve has been a great colleague, a dear friend, and it's always fascinating to be invited to give talks in places like this, which we know are springing with and vibrant with new insights and ideas. So I'm delighted to be able to be here. It was a little bit of a long commute this morning. So and I'm jet lagged because I came back from a talk in the States a couple of days ago. So if you see me starting to not make sense, don't feel that you have to follow. Just interrupt me and ask me to backtrack, because sometimes I fail towards the end of the day. Thank you for being here on this very nice day. I know that you probably had better options to be outside and enjoy the sun, but I hear you might have a few more days of warm weather coming up over the weekend, so maybe this will be your reward, and then you can have more fun outside. What I will talk to you about today is an interesting broad project that I'm interested in, that looks at the interface of emotions, political tolerance, and how in general we orient ourselves towards groups in society. So there are two experimental studies here that come together. One is looking at political tolerance and the role of anger and fear in stimulating or mitigating tolerance. And the other one is a sister baby project that we're starting now with a colleague at the University of Surrey at the Department of Psychology. I'm in politics, Harriet is in psychology, where we're looking at perceptions of rights, human rights for asylum seekers. There's also a new colleague in law that is coming as part of this project, and we're hoping to build up a broader research agenda and submit it as a research bid somewhere in the summer. The first part of the talk is on a published paper, but it helps us, and that's why I decided to talk to you about it today, because it gives you kind of like the underlying premises where the next part of the talk, the second part of the talk relies on. And the second part of the talk is a small pretest study that we run. It has some good things, it has more wrong things than things that went right with it, but that's the purpose of a pretest, that's the lesson, that's why we did it. So we have some ideas on how to move forward, and I wanted to run them by you, because that's what I did last week at the conference in the US as well. So that as we move to the new stage of the project, we avoid the same mistake. So anyway, let's move on. I give you a little bit of an idea of why we're studying this. Negative attitudes, actually you're an easy audience to sell this to. You will understand the value of being able to disentangle the determinants of political prejudice or political tolerance on its positive end towards migrants or minority groups in society. So there's a series of studies that we know that have been looking at how these groups are being received, so mainly public opinion studies, that gives us negative or a little bit disheartening results. They basically tell us that young people are particularly susceptible to negative prejudices, particularly young people from minority group descent or young asylum seekers. So that's an interesting group to investigate. And also we know that although Europe is rich with Muslim populations and very diverse, countries like the Netherlands or the UK, where you would expect higher levels of integration, or tolerance if you want, although tolerance requires a negative predisposition. To be tolerant you need, as we will see in a little bit, to have a negative attitude, but allow things to happen. In any way, even in the Netherlands, where I used to live before, in the UK, there is public concern with immigrants taking over our country, right? And in that public concern debate, people are starting to negotiate the rights of these people. And that's why when we look at words like posing threat to British culture, it's what stimulates us to get engaged and do a little bit more work to get to the bottom of how citizens arrive at these tolerance judgments or intolerance judgments. So we are looking at majority majority populations and how they arrive at their judgments towards minority groups. In here, Muslims in one experiment, asylum seekers, young asylum seekers in the next one. Yeah. So the first experiment is about adults. They evaluate Muslim youth groups. It's an experimental study where we manipulate the emotional condition of the evaluation. So we make people a little bit angry, not very much, a little bit afraid, and then we see how these emotions interact with their pre-existing dispositions in politics. So in other words, their political values, and how emotions and political values can give us particular combinations of outcomes that are really very interesting. And this is the publication of the study there if you want the reference, or I can send it to you if you're interested a little bit more about the details of this work. The second one looks at particularly young people and how they perceive the rights of their young counterparts who are asylum seekers. And then again, we're playing with fear and anger. We expose our participants to the emotions, and we also did interviews with them, trying to go a little bit more deeper to the discursive element of their attitudes. So we were trying to identify moral, let me see if I can point this, social conventional outcomes and practicality considerations, justifications in their responses when they were telling us whether they support or they don't support particular rights. And this is the pretest study that I was telling you about. So tolerance, this is the beginning of our most interesting here dependent variable that we're trying to explain. What does it depend on? It implies the willingness to permit the expressions of others, the right of others, even when you oppose them, right? So to be tolerant, you have to have a little bit of disagreement there, but allow others to live. And when we see studies from fellow political psychologists that are trying to disentangle why tolerance matters and how it has implications for political preferences and support for groups, they find that it's mainly our emotions towards groups that get us going when we are involved in situations where we have to exhibit tolerance. And they tested this in environments that generated anxiety and threat, and they find that if you just look at the emotional content, when you're looking at an environment that generates anxiety and threat, tolerance goes down. You would expect that, right? You become more alert to a negative situation, and it's the negativity of that situation that makes the tolerance lower. So it's that heightened perception of threat, so you pay more attention to the stimuli around you. If the stimulus around you is negative, then you pay more attention to that negative environment, right? Because when you're threatened, you have that hardwired response to scan the environment for information. If the environment is negative, then you become more negative. That's what the theory suggests, right? So threat is associated with interesting for us to study phenomena and really hard-pressing phenomena like political intolerance, prejudice, ethnocentrism, some hard words here, xenophobia. Yeah, there's a series of studies looking at just threat and what it does to our perceptions. But tolerance is a more complicated story. It's not just about how we feel. So it's not just me feeling threatened, becoming more intolerant. What I have up in here in my head also affects how I react to political stimuli. So it's a more reactive process from the citizen's point of view. So what Kinder found in response to these studies in 1998 is that my predispositions towards political values, my principles, interact with the environment, and if I have strong support for civil liberties, what happens is that I am not getting more afraid, even in a threatening scenario, therefore I'm not getting more intolerant. So what they found is that I stop and think. If there is a value conflict, I stop and think, but my pre-existing values, opinions, beliefs about a particular group can stop the intolerance as it strikes, right? It doesn't have a negative effect on me. So they were looking at more permanent value considerations and also individual characteristics like education. In politics, we often call it political sophistication, how much elegant your thinking style is or versus how raw. And also cognitive sophistication, tasks that are outside politics when it comes to accepting others. Yeah? And if you want more detailed reference because you're working on this work, feel free to email me and I'll send you the full list. So tolerance on one hand, emotions on the other. So we know now that emotions play a role, and they might play a complicated role because they are usually stress-related emotions like anger and fear, and we see them in lots of psychology and political psychology studies that are linked to perceptions of threat, as I said before, yeah, and they influence how we form our judgments about others in society. However, when you take those two emotions, although they seem to be very often in political psychology or political science, political psychology, classified as negative emotions, they have very different psychological, neural, and behavioral manifestations. And since this is a department where you have neuropolitics as well, I think this resonates well with you. You probably know this literature better than I do. So both of these cause the heart beat to rise. But when you're afraid, you feel cold, or you have a feeling that you're feeling cold. When you're angry, you're feeling hot, right? And the way we talk about it, my blood is boiling, this very simplistic way of talking about it is an indication that we all are aware of what happens to our bodies when we get angry. Fear, we sweat a little bit more. Anger, we don't have statistical evidence that signifies that we sweat when we're angry. We usually sweat a little bit more when we're afraid. Our brain operates differently under these emotions. When we're afraid, there is a different part of the brain that's stimulated that is associated with withdrawal, flying, going away. Whereas anger stimulates part of the brain that are related to approaching the stimuli, right? Going at it. Different behavioral functions. So behavioral differences, fear. Fear is associated, and we've seen this replicate time and again also in political studies that we run. George Marcus has a lot of stuff, a lot of studies that come out on this, that fear is associated with limited capacity to use cognitive abilities under high threat, but higher capacities to use cognitive abilities if it is low fear as kind of like stimulation. So fear at different levels plays differently with your cognitive capacity, whereas anger evokes responsibility attributions. And you start thinking, when you're angry, who's to blame? That's the first thing you're looking at, rather than scanning the environment for more information, which is what you tend to do when you're afraid. We also find relation of these emotions with outgroups. Fear provides us usually pessimistic risk estimates, whereas anger gives us optimistic risk estimates and aggression towards others. Different political events associated with these emotions. Again, with fear, we see pessimism and preference to reach a conciliation, right, an agreement, whereas anger, we feel optimistic about what's going on in the future and we want punishment, right? We go for punitive preferences, and that's on policy positions. So there is reason, biological reason, behavioral reason, cognitive reason to expect that these two emotions don't do the same thing, right? So there are reasons to try to unpack their impact. So we're bringing it together. And there have been a few studies that have actually brought them together that give us insights on how to continue. So Gibson and Bingham at 82 looked at the interaction of the cognitive and emotional elements as determinants of tolerance, so very close to what we're looking at here. And they came up with particular predictions talking about anxiety and its relationship with your pre-existing values. The argument is that when you have tolerance promoting thoughts, because that's the person you are politically, that's where you stand and that's what you believe. So in that context, you hold strong democratic values, then fear, it's not going to make you more intolerant, as the simple political psychology studies would have predicted, but it will make you more tolerant, because fear basically solidifies your existing state and it makes it stronger, so you can withstand this. So when you're afraid, your cultural values are strengthened, and people who value civil liberties are able to hold their opinion even under threatening environments, right? But again, it's all a matter of where the tipping point is. Yeah, when that fear becomes a very strong threat. Because in other studies that we've done right after the aftermath of 9/11 with Leonie Hardy and Stanley Feldman, we find that if it is actually your physical threat, that plays a different role, right? Even your civil liberties, you start negotiating them. And we've seen this in practice in the US as well, right after 9/11. What happens with anxiety, not anxiety, is that you also become sensitive to negative information. So if there are negative opinions there, your anxiety goes up. It's all this interaction with emotion and cognition, basically. So you become more sensitive towards the new information, and that drops your tolerance. So it depends on where you stand, right? What your predispositions are. And then if you bring into that the qualitative differences in anger stress and fear stress, the expectation here is that when we're angry, we will have tolerance decline, because anger is not mediated by values. When we're angry, we don't think. So what we think should not play as much of a role. That's the argument, right? If when you're angry, you just charge, you don't stop and think, whatever you have in the back of your mind is still in the back of your mind. So anger should not be giving us differences, intolerance on the basis of your pre-existing cultural positions, yeah, or political positions. Whereas fear, because it stimulates, it allows cognitive processing to happen, fear should be the place where these interactions with your pre-existing values should happen, right? So we don't expect effects for angry people, but we do expect different effects for people who are afraid on the basis of whether these people are having strong civic, let's say, pre-existing tolerance or not. Yeah? Do you follow me there? Yeah? All right. So let's look a little bit at what Harriet has been doing and reasoning about human rights. There are studies now in the UK that are giving us really useful insights about young people and how they think about human rights. And if we accept that these guys are the new generation, the upcoming generation voting in new elections, it is really interesting to try to unpack what's going on in their heads. So they've been, in previous studies, before we got together and started working on this, they've been doing also hypothetical scenarios where you have Muslim asylum seekers. So this is where our work kind of got together. And they found that British people support the rights of asylum-seeking youth when the frame, and we all understand frames, is one that stimulates nurturance scenarios rather than self-determination rights. Very interesting political and policy implications for governments that want to promote policies that support human rights among young. Frame it as nurturance, people will like it. Frame it as self-determination, you will get more opposition, right? That's the raw and cynical interpretation of these findings. And we also find out that, again, young people don't think about human rights in a too simplistic way. So they think about nurturance and protection rights, and when they do that, they focus on empathetic considerations. Whereas if you prime self-determination rights, then they start talking more about obedience to authority. So what comes out in the content of their conversations are elements that have authority keywords in there. Whereas when they talk about nurturance, they think of warm stuff, empathy, right? Taking care of people, liking them, loving them, supporting them. That's, in other words, what it is. Whereas if you get them to think about human rights that preserve the individual's right to stand alone, right? To be self-determined, to live where they want, to eat what they want, to read what they want, to dress as they want. What they then start talking about is whether that's okay, if that is in line with what the authority wants us to do, right? Different considerations come to mind based on the frame. And we also find that when we talk to them about different types of rights, if you give them religious rights, they support them more because they see it as a moral right of the individual rather than non-religious rights. And that's also interesting for us. So bringing everything together here, we were interested to see how young people in the second study think about the rights of asylum seekers. We're going to be looking at anger and fear, and we expect that low levels of fear encourage cognitive processing, and it's in those conditions that your pre-existing impressions kick in. Yeah. And then we are hypothesizing that if you are induced to feel anxious, you will extend fewer rights if your pre-existing reasoning is negative. But if you have positive attitudes, when you're induced to feel anxious, you will become more tolerant, basically. Yeah? Or allow for more rights. Are we all together? Yeah? All right. Do you have any questions? Should I stop here and take a couple of... Oh, you okay? Moving on? Okay. So, 2 experiments. The first, and I will give you the methodology and then the results. So the study participants here were an online sample of 88 adults. It's not the MTurk that everybody uses in the States these days. It was a snowball sample, I think, of adults who agreed to participate. And then we asked them questions about a fictional group called Youth for Islam. It involved evaluations of young people, so you have adults evaluating young folks. And we measured social distance, civil rights, and we gave them 3 scenarios, a calm scenario and then a stressful that varied as anger and fear. I'll tell you about the design in a minute. And we marked it as 2 surveys. We told them first we want to give you a general survey about your opinions in politics, and we asked them in that survey also measures of baseline tolerance. I'll show you in a minute how we measure that. And then we told them, here's some information about this group. They were demonstrating, they're a good group. Here's information about a group. It's a new group. It's called Youth for Islam. This is what they stand for. It was kind of bland, right? So we wanted to introduce a calm scenario. We asked them to evaluate the group. We got measures on traits, their competence, their integrity, their overall evaluation, and also measures of tolerance. We didn't want to ask only about tolerance because you get people primed, right? So we tried to hide it in multiple evaluations. And then we gave everybody a second article with a negative event where the group is participating in a demonstration and they're holding banners that would make people who were present, bystanders, feel angry or afraid. So the manipulation is a very mild one. It's one by projection in a way, or social projection. Feeling, if I was in that situation, if I was a bystander, I would have been feeling like these bystanders. And we didn't even prime that. We just told them that people who were bystanders were feeling either angry or they felt afraid. It was about 200 words in a news story, and then we asked them their evaluations again. The baseline tolerance measure is one that is used very often in political psychology. We ask them to identify their least like group in society, and then we ask them questions on that least like group. And then we group them for this analysis that I'm presenting here on people that gave us groups that belong in the extreme right category, so we lumped them all together for the analysis, and also another group that was giving us names of groups that were basically immigrant groups. And then if there were some that were giving us as a least like group politicians or bankers or anything else, we take them out because they're not relevant for today. Yeah? So we asked them, should they be allowed to make a public speech? Do you think that group from the Youth of Islam, now particularly to the scenario, would you be comfortable if they're sitting next to you? And would you be happy if they were part of your friends? Right? And we do that before the anger, fear, manipulation and after the anger, fear, manipulation. And we also, here's the calm scenario. We ask them, we tell them that it's this group, it gets a subsidy from the Dutch government, the group stands for good stuff. There's a public opinion poll indicating that the general public has moderate feelings. So we just wanted a bland description there, right? That's believable as much as possible because that's published in the news. And then the two types of stressful scenarios, the angry and the afraid, is what I was saying before. Participants read that bystanders felt angry, the other half felt that they felt afraid. And then we also asked them to see if they recalled information, because part of the theory suggests that you remember more stuff when you're angry. When you're afraid. And we didn't find any of that there, but we thought it would be a good test. So, findings. Does tolerance decrease when we get stressed? Statistically significant differences with the different superscripts, right? That's how we do it in political science. I don't know if you guys do the same reports, but the A's and the B's show you statistically significant differences here at 0.05 level for the same row mean. So you're only going across, right? You don't go down for this analysis here. And measures of honesty, trust, overall evaluation towards the group, how anxious it makes you feel, how safe it makes you feel, how violent you think they are, significantly changing on the basis of moving from the calm to the stressful. So, okay, the manipulation works fine in terms of the negative piece of information. What happens with anger and fear? Nothing. Now, this is not the whole story, so it doesn't finish here, but if you look at it and you stop poking a little further, you can go away with a kind of disappointing finding that, look, anger and fear conditions, tolerance is about the same. Honesty, projections, expectations of the group about the same. Trust, how much you trust that group, about the same. Overall evaluation about the same. They're lower than the calm scenario, but between them we don't see any substantive differences. So if you just look at the emotional response, that's not the whole story. That's not where the interesting stuff lies. So we started looking a little deeper. We were expecting deeper findings anyway. So let's move on a little bit further. What you do is, what you find if you break them down by the group that dislike the extreme right, yeah, so these are people with strong civic values, and people who dislike immigrants, this is the association with the target group, yeah. What you find there is statistically significant differences. These guys become more negative, yeah, significantly more negative, moving from calm to stressful. And here it is. And this is interesting here. These folks up here, these are the ones who dislike the extreme right. Yeah, these are the strong civic value people. Whether they were calm or they were stressful, they didn't budge. Their tolerance remains the same. Yeah? So their pre-existing cognitions allow them to stay firm in place because they have what it takes to counter-argue the negative environment, right? They still have some leftover tolerance or some leftover belief in that group that allows them to say, no, I still support them, right? What happens here is in the group that dislikes immigrants, in the calm scenario, you see the movement. Of course, they are lower. They are lower to begin with because the group they dislike is similar to the target group. It's not the Youth for Islam because it's a fictional group, but they've initially said that they dislike immigrants and Youth of Islam is immigrants, so one thing leads to the other. So they start at a lower place to begin with, but they drop further, and they drop further significantly when you get them, when you look at how they operate in the stressful scenarios. Let's try to unpack the emotions now, right? Before we were talking about stress, no stress. So either the neutral or the anger and the fear lumped together. Now we're going to look at what happens when we try to disentangle them. So maybe this is not the best way to represent it because you could see the differences in the means are not very much here, but they're becoming very interesting here. Yeah, that's where the superscript starts becoming different. Yeah, but let me show you this like that. And if I show you this like that, that's a clear story. These are your folks that dislike the extreme right. Yeah, these are, let's call them your tolerant folks. Yeah, with the strong civic values and support for democratic principles, because they correlate very strongly there. They don't move. I banged the camera. So they don't move no matter what you do to them. They can be angry, they can be afraid, they can be calm. They are all at the same place. Yeah? Maybe a little fluctuation, but nothing interesting. Look at the folks who dislike immigrants. You see a big move on the basis of their emotional status. When they're calm and when they're angry, they're down here. So anger doesn't do much. They're already angry. I mean, they already don't like them, so they don't become more. But when you make them afraid, that fear interacts with their negative predispositions, right? And it brings them even lower down here. Yeah? And that's an interesting difference. If you put a 0.5 as the average point, this brings them up, this brings them down. So politically, that can have serious implications. So if you put it in a regression, basically you get the same picture. It is the fear with its interaction with disliking immigrants, yeah, your pre-existing values, that is negative and brings the effect even lower. So what do we find? We find that anger and fear together appear to have negative impact on tolerance, but what we try to unpack is their interaction with cognition, with pre-existing values. So when you are afraid, those who dislike immigrants were most likely to decrease their tolerance than people who were angry. And then when fear was mediated with support for democratic values, those folks on the very left corner, nothing happened there, right? So tolerance remained the same. Second experiment, what we did is we wanted students, we wanted kids, because we said, okay, let's go and try some things differently now. So we wanted 16 to 18-year-olds. We had to go to school from comprehensives and colleges located in low and middle income areas, because we thought these are pressurized places. So that's where you are supposed to find the tensions with immigrant groups. You come in contact with them, they're part of your community. Contact is sometimes good, sometimes bad, but it's part of your reality. So these are the students who are more likely to be talking about these topics. We had to get clearance from their families. Most of them were participants from families with lower levels of education, because studies show that lower levels of education predict prejudice, right? The flip side of the political science studies that show that high levels of education predict tolerance, yeah? And then we exposed them first to a 5-minute snippet of a film with strong emotional content. We thought it was strong emotional content of either fear or anger. And then we interviewed them about their views towards the right of asylum seekers. And we had the control participants interviewed without watching the films that would generate the emotional reaction that we wanted. We checked the emotion with a manipulation check. I'll tell you in a minute about that. And then we gave them a questionnaire with vignettes explaining different types of rights of asylum seekers, playing with the frame basically, and seeing what they were telling us back in interviews and whether their support changed. So we measure strength of support and also their response. What kind of reactions were they giving us when they were talking about things? So the films that we used, one was The Sixth Sense and the other one is The Bodyguard. Okay? And they are studies that have been found to be associated with strong emotions of anger and fear respectively. That's why we use them. Now it might be that the world of adults is not the same as the world of young kids, because it did stimulate a little bit of an anxiety thing, but it didn't make them particularly afraid, the anger manipulation. And coincidentally, there were a couple of folks that were in the panel I was at last week in New York who used the same ones, going by the literature, for for their experiments on similar, on human rights, and they didn't find anything either. So they were basically saying, we ditched it, and we will use different ways. Maybe the fictional scenario we used in the first experiment is the way to go. Maybe asking them this autobiographical information to write about something that made them angry or make them afraid. That seems to work in the literature, so we can go that way. I'll bring that back to you as a question later. And then we asked them to complete the multiple affect checklist, which is a big 132 adjectives. You scale them together then in groups like anxiety, depression, hostility, positive, affect and sensation seeking. And I'll show you. It's good that we did that because we had experiential emotions and they work. The manipulation didn't quite work, but the experienced emotions go the direction we want. Although with an N of 30, you can't really argue for statistical significance, yeah? Okay, so the anxiety score, they become more anxious than angry, but the anger score and the hostility score doesn't, we don't see, they are more afraid than angry, right? So it didn't quite work the way we wanted. What were we recording? Types of reasoning. So we were looking at moral reasoning, that is whether they are talking about fairness, rights, equality. We were looking at social conventional reasoning, whether they talk about norms, authority, rules. We were looking at outcomes. Do they come up with saying this is a good outcome or a bad outcome for that individual that receives the right? Or practical considerations to solve the situation. So this is the more qualitative part of the work down at the bottom. All right, and what do we find? Okay. When it comes to support for human rights, and these are just means, overall, on a 0 to 5 scale, their support for human rights is high, right? So these groups, although we didn't measure their pre-existing levels of tolerance towards different groups in society because we were not allowed by the schools to do that, and we have to rely kind of like to this, which is a post-test, and it's a little contaminated with the manipulation, so it's not clear. But what we see is that overall, they're on the high end. And we were a little bit pressed, we're thinking about this, but we thought, well, what part of the manipulation might have made them change their mind about headscarves? Or I'll tell you what mom is, a scenario that says, can the mom have access to see the child? Or practicing religion, or issues about puberty or money, having money to buy the school uniform. This was, how would our manipulation change them completely? And most likely they didn't. So we think they have pre-existing support for human rights. And in line with what the literature suggests, religious scenarios get high support. Nurture scenarios, remember what I told you at the beginning, this is the stuff we already knew, and it comes up, they follow the same patterns, which is good, makes us think that there is some consistency in all our studies. In-school scenarios get more support, although they're not that different from out-school scenarios. Non-religious scenarios get the lowest support. Yeah. This is on a 0 to 20 scale. And in terms of what they were saying, the types of responses, when we content analyzed them, most of them are moral responses by far. Yeah? And then social conventional outcomes and practical were the least mentioned considerations in response to the rights we were giving them. Now, what I want you to look at here, although I think the decimal points are a little confusing, what's interesting here, these are the two manipulations, anger, fear, when you're afraid, and remember these are folks who are tolerant to begin with, yeah, based on their high means. Fear makes you more tolerant. Fear makes you more tolerant. It's consistent across. Yeah? So fear gives you more, bumps you higher. Higher support for rights in this case, not tolerance measure, is not very clean because again we were not allowed to ask tolerance questions, but higher support for rights. And they're not statistically significant apart from over here where you see some differences with the control, but because it's small n samples, as you can see, we don't have, it's not publishable stuff, but it's in the right direction. Now, what happens with the experienced emotions? This is the high anxiety here versus the low anxiety, and I split them up in people who experienced a lot of anxiety after the manipulation. The control group is not part of this because they were not part of the story. So what you see again consistently is that high anxiety leads to higher tolerance than low anxiety. Hostility, anger tells you a different story. Hostility, here you have high hostility to low tolerance, high hostility to low tolerance, or to be more precise, high hostility, lower support for human rights consistently throughout. And this is what we were interested in. We thought, well, there might be something going on that's in line with how adults are thinking about things. Because again, what you see is that this group is positive to begin with, but then they become more positive when they're afraid, but more negative when they're angry, although these are experienced emotions. And again, these are the moral responses appearing more in the fear condition up there. And this is very confusing. I don't know how to make it. Maybe I'll skip it in the interest of time because I've been talking for about over half hour now, and we'll come back to it. But these are the experienced experienced emotions, and the reasoning and the patterns in the experienced emotions don't follow the patterns of the manipulated emotions when they think about different responses to their rights, moral, social conventional outcomes, or practical. Anyway, going back to this, what do we want to keep? That the emotions manipulation, we need to ditch it. We need to find another way to play with their feelings. That religious, nurture, and in school, maybe proximity-related scenarios seem to be the ones that get higher support. Moral responses are the ones that we get more, about twice as frequently as any of the other categories. When they're afraid, we see higher support for rights compared to anger. Experienced anxiety leads also to higher support. Higher hostility, the opposite, higher hostility, higher anger, leads to lower support of rights. And that's basically where it's at, I think. Yeah. If you have a question about how the scenarios were, I have them here. If you want to use them for your work, I'm happy to share them. But all of the ones that I had because I just realized the tables were shorthand for the scenarios, all of them are here. So we can go back and see them if anybody has questions about how we do things. Yeah?
Okay, well, we do have time for questions. Plenty of time for questions. So, are there any questions?
Feel free to take it apart. It's to be taken apart because that's what we care about. Is how to make it better. Yeah.
So in your first experiment, the anger or the fear was specifically directed at that group in particular, whereas in the second experiment, it was a more general priming of anger or fear external from it. Do you think those are similar mechanisms and would have similar effects overall, or do you think those are two different kinds of influences?
I think it's a great question. It's one we've been struggling with. In political psychology studies that look at anger and fear, very often what we have is that the manipulated emotion is one associated with the target. And that's why the first study was designed that way. It just puts it straight to home, right? You feel afraid. Actually, somebody else feels afraid or angry. It's a societal emotion about that group. And then it seeps through your body and you feel that way too, maybe. Although it was a very, we thought, mild manipulation, just asking people to read, yeah, it was associated with the target. In the second experiment, it wasn't. And we did that intentionally because our argument was, if it is anger, if it is fear, if the argument is that it works inside your head or inside your heart or both, right, to alter what you rely on when you make decisions, that should happen regardless of whether it's a contextual emotion, if it is an individual emotion because it happened to you experientially, you just happen to be angry today or you happen to be afraid today, or it is something associated with the target. It might work strongly with the target, but the theory would not expect to only work when it's associated with the target, if it is the emotion that's generating the biological response that we were expecting. So we wanted to test it. Now, we didn't find it. They became anxious in both. Well, they became more anxious than angry in the anger condition. But again, when you look at the experienced emotions, it seems to hold a little bit, although the means are not statistically significant, they are in the right direction. So there might be something there. It needs a little bit more investigation, I think, for us to be able to know The broader theory would be if it works in both cases and it gives us clear results, then it's the emotion and it's not just the relationship with the target. If we have to compromise and say, oh, you know, emotions only when they're related to the target, it makes the theory a little bit more difficult to sell, I guess.
Yeah, I personally was surprised that you chose the Bodyguard movie as the anger-inducing. I can't imagine even the bit you used from it for anger.
There's a fight scene apparently in the Bodyguard.
But what I was thinking, these are movies our generation and younger generations watch maybe really early, and now there are much more intense and much scarier movies available. Which maybe would
That's a scary thought. I think you're probably right. Yeah.
Because now I don't know. You can watch scary Japanese movies, which probably are like 10 times scarier than The Sixth Sense. And as well for anger, I think that The Bodyguard is kind of considered as a more romantic movie at this point. So I don't know, maybe even just updating the movies to the contemporary kind of.
We did. We used the ones that worked. We used the ones we wanted to be super safe, because when we applied for human subjects, we had to approval. We had to guarantee that nothing was gonna. And then if you say, oh, they have been tested before and they work and they cause no harm to participants, the panels are likely to just sign off on it, and that's why we went with it. And we thought there was a guarantee that they have worked before. Apparently not. In our case, so I take your explanation that maybe younger generations are more conditioned to violence these days, and they just don't experience the anger the way we would expect them to. Yeah, it's possible that it's that. We had to go with them because they had the particular rating as well, so we couldn't show them something that was too extreme because we would never pass it through. Their parents or human subjects. So it had to be something that would generate anger, but reasonable enough to say you didn't harm my children irreparably, right? So it's that thing when you're dealing with kids.
What about asking them to recall an event which made them angry or scared?
What we were thinking, and that I wanted to table it, and then you give me your ideas, because we have 30 brains thinking rather than 2 here. What we were thinking is do that as even a manipulation in the experiment, to do one where we ask them to recall an experience that made them angry or afraid, and we found that these kind of diary little studies work well. And actually the other folks that were in the panel said that they did it like that afterwards and it worked, right? So we could do that, which is unrelated, an emotion unrelated to the target, and keep the existing manipulation of the first experiment where we have an emotion related to the target as well, and see what happens when emotion is related to the target or emotion is unrelated to the target.
So I think I'm thinking about the right film. I'm thinking of The Bodyguard. It fills me with fear, having to listen to bloody Whitney Houston wail out once again.
I have the snippets of the film. Maybe I'll send it to you. It's a little excerpts in YouTube that I can send it to you. I think there is a thing where they're fighting. I don't know. I don't remember. It's been a long time. And to be honest, I haven't watched the little snippets that we gave them because I just did.
But even just the idea of the movie, I'm sorry, it's just because personal associations, the way you saw it, the way you watched it, I always watched it maybe, you know, in a different way, or like when I was very little, so I know it by heart and it doesn't scare me anymore or make me angry. Yeah. But remembering their own scenarios, I think that's a great idea, because they have such an emotion associated with it. While the emotion of the movie, they can have personal experiences completely different.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, I've been thinking about the terms, and I mean, first of all, sort of the notion of tolerance, because looking at the historical and the philosophical literature, there's a really big literature which points out that when you look at extreme forms of hostility against the out-group, they're very often associated with a notion of some level of virtue of the in-group. Okay, so there's work on the notion of the in-group as pure, and how once the in-group is seen as pure, and the presence of the other becomes more problematic because it pollutes us, it undermines us, it threatens us. There is quite a lot of work there's Kunz's work on Nazi virtue, which makes the point that Nazism was seen as a project of virtue, such that the threat from the out-group was then an assault upon virtue, and the consequence of that was the destruction of the other became a defense of virtue. So you get this paradox of values like tolerance within that particular sort of configuration actually can be the source of a problem. In a sense, there's a liberal anti-liberalism. And I used to show people, Tony Blair had this very famous speech about immigration in 2006, which actually was taken quite seriously, but when you show it to people, they laugh, because what it basically says is, we're a wonderfully tolerant country, and we're full of terribly tolerant values, therefore, we've got to kick these people out because they're intolerant. And so I wonder, first of all, that rather than speaking about these two interacting factors of emotion and values, it seems to me that actually what one's trying to get at is the specific meanings of the presence of the other, which are both a cognition but also an emotion. It's telling you what they mean for you and whether they're dangerous or not. So I wonder whether, when you have, for instance, fear within a particular ideological configuration, is it the same fear or does it have a different meaning of what is actually going on? And that's, given that, it does seem to me that there might be times when tolerance as a value is not a good thing. It doesn't make us behave better. Actually, it makes the assumed problem of the other even more toxic and therefore legitimates even more extreme behavior. So I'm sort of, in a sense, what I'm asking about is, first of all, the very distinction you're making and the notion of independent factors interacting in predictable patterns. And I suppose more specifically, I'm asking about when is tolerance a problem? And to bring it back home, another great advantage of Scotland is not only is the weather better than in England, but also we don't have UKIP in quite the same way. You are in Guildford where you have UKIP, and if you watch what they're doing, Farage continuously talks about British values of tolerance and British values of decency and this, that and the other in order to justify this sort of toxic notion of they're changing all that, so it justifies us doing awful things.
Yeah, well, this is the thing, I agree with you and I couldn't agree more. It's a challenging task to try to disentangle the use of the term itself from the way it's been adopted in political discourses and political rhetoric. Because we know in politics you take one word and you make it your own and then it changes its value, it loses its meaning. In this particular one, in the second experiment we did not measure tolerance. Actually it's a little bit of a stretch to talk about tolerance because what we talk about is support for human rights, right? Towards groups, so if we want to be thorough and clear. But the first one does have a thorough measure, and I'm just going to go back just to show you what we asked them, right? Here. Maybe this is not. Yeah, here's the same thing. So what we asked them about the group. So tolerance, the definition of tolerance in the literature that we were going by is your ability to allow others to have rights even, there is this potentially question about whether you like them or you dislike them, right? It's allowing others to have rights even in these conditions. But here, we asked them also how safe you feel and whether you think that group is violent. Yeah? So we try to get in a little bit more detail. What we do find though is, I think we are arriving at the same thing, but you're going at it from a different point of view. Because if you have these guys, the Farage, call them UKIP guys, they very much could be UKIP guys, who dislike immigrants. This is the group they identified as the one they dislike the most. Yeah, and they were giving us names of immigrant groups or just the category generally. And then we group them together. So they're the ones that are lower to begin with. So it's this thing here in the graph that, so they can be talking about tolerance. They could be saying that they're tolerant, but what they mean, the way they experience it, is very different from these folks. And I think these values that they have that makes their tolerance different from their tolerance. And it's a difference of about 20 points on a 100-point scale. So they do start off differently. But then they move differently as well. These guys don't budge. Now, they don't budge because, and this is where I start struggling a little bit with this idea of us people who dislike the extreme right, us people who have strong civic values, are more resilient to tolerance, or more resilient to negative judgment. What if the manipulated group, the target group, was extreme right group? And I don't have the answer to that, because this can be just confounding. The fact that it happened that the group that they dislike the most is the group that dislikes the target group. So by association, they like the target group. So I think it's a little dangerous for us to think, oh, these are the good folks that dislike the extreme right. They are the ones who should stand strong. Therefore, look, they're always going to be tolerant. One thing we want to do as another part of this experiment, and I didn't want to bring it, but here it is to play with the group, the target group, and make it an extreme right group. Because there, we'll see if we see movement. If they still stay there, it is their civic values. If they don't, then forget civic values. It's just that they like to be seen as, and it was a convenient scenario for them, right? It was an immigrant group. They dislike the people who hate immigrants, so they are put in an easy situation in a way, and they are put in a difficult situation. So we would like to test this a little further. But going back to what you're saying, yeah, can tolerance be a problem? For these guys, yes, it can. For societies like the Netherlands, it has been a problem. And that's why we started this when we started it back there. Because we were thinking, this is supposed to be a very tolerant society, and see what happens. Yeah? When you have 30% of your population telling you that Muslims are bad, or Muslims hate us, or Muslims are going to hurt us, and they interact with Muslims on their everyday life, they go to school with them, they eat with them, they shop from their same shops, right? They walk in the same streets, on the same streets, then you have a problem. Yeah. But tolerance by name is not tolerance by experience, and that's what we were trying to tease apart, right? Does that come?
Yeah.
Anyways? Yeah.
Any other questions? In that case, I think it's time for a drink. So thank you very much indeed, Tereza, and long may you stay here in the weather, stay like this with you. This is what it's like when you go up. So thanks very much indeed.
Thank you, thank you.
Make it all worthwhile, you get a free gift.
Oh, that's very nice. And it's not a free gift, it's a gift, because gifts are always free, but it's a good gift. Thank you.